Greetings, everyone. Welcome to yet another interview by The Probe, the official publication of Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College. Caucus is a 17-year-old think tank, and we were formed in 2007 to discuss international affairs and foreign relations. The Probe was formed in 2020, and we have served as a progressive platform to discuss issues critically and hold power to account, to question entrenched hierarchies and notions that are trotted around here and there by the establishment and so on. And today, we are elated to have with us Mouin Rabbani, one of the preeminent experts on the geopolitical affairs of the Middle East with us. So thank you so much, sir, for
It's a
giving.
real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving us your time. So, just to start off with a broad overview, um, the situation that has been taking place in Palestine has very deep roots, and it's
Yeah.
evident to anyone who has read about the issue. So, how do you reflect on how the issue has been covered by the media, right? From, let's say, the Nakba or the affairs before that, to what has to the evolution that has occurred post October 7th. So, how do you reflect upon the
Hmm.
evolution of this coverage?
Well, let's specify the Western media, and particularly the Western mainstream media, because I think if you look at the global media, there tends to be a much better understanding of the issue. If you look at the way the crisis has been covered in the Western media during the past year, there tends to be an assumption that history started on October 7th, 2023, and that what preceded it is not really relevant to understanding either October 7th or what happened thereafter. And when there is attention paid to the period before, it's often presented very much through a Zionist Israeli perspective. This whole narrative of the Jews who endured 2,000 years of exile from their homeland, finally returning against all the odds. And then, of course, in the wake of the terrors of the German Holocaust, miraculously managing to successfully establish their state, even though the entire region was determined to wipe them out and exterminate them and basically finish Hitler's job. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature, but that is generally how the question of Palestine is represented in the West. The reality is, of course, very different. And I should add, the other one is to kind of present this as a conflict. First of all, a conflict as if it's between two states. Um, and then also a conflict that is the product of ancient hatreds that have been around with us so long that we'll never properly understand them. So there's a clear separation between what is an Arab on the one hand and what is a Jew on the other. They're mutually exclusive. You can't be an Arab and a Jew. And they've been at war with each other since time immemorial, and particularly since the advent of Islam. A caricature, but I think it's fair to say that on the whole is generally how it's represented in the West. The reality, of course, is very different, which is that in the 19th century, in an era where European Jewish leaders and thinkers were grappling with the twin dynamics of Jewish emancipation in Western Europe and intensified persecution of the Jews in Eastern Europe, grappling with what was known as the Jewish question, and various ideas were put forward to address this. One was, for example, intensified religious orthodoxy. Another one was to advocate for liberal democracy in which Jews would be assimilated in their respective states as equal citizens. And then there was also, of course, the trend of revolutionary socialism, which also had many Jewish adherents. And then there was a new idea that came along, and that was called Zionism. And Zionism is essentially Jewish nationalism. The idea that the Jews of Europe specifically form not only a religious community, are not only citizens of this state, but are also a distinct nation and people. And in the spirit of the times, we're talking about 19th century Europe. Well, if you're a nation and you're a people, you of course have to have a nation state, and the nation state is one in which the nation enjoys uncontested political, territorial, and demographic supremacy. And it is in that context that Zionism chose the path of establishing a Jewish state, of establishing it in Palestine, which by definition meant the transformation of Palestine from an Arab territory into an exclusivist Jewish state. And I don't want to get too much into historical details, but that is kind of the essential background to understanding everything that has happened since. It culminated in 1948 with the proclamation of the Jewish state and the mass expulsion of the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, Arab Muslims and Christians, who lived on that land. And it is in that context, for example, that the Gaza Strip was formed. No one had ever heard of the Gaza Strip before 1948 because it didn't exist. But as a result of what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe of their mass expulsion, their mass dispossession in 1948, the 1% of mandatory Palestine that remained under Arab controlled Egyptian administration in this case was transformed into a narrow strip of land where the 80,000 original pre-existing residents were joined by approximately 200,000 refugees. I should add, since you're contacting me from India, of course, the root of all evil in this case, too, was the British Empire, which not only seized control of Palestine at the end of the First World War and adopted a program formally to transform Palestine into what it called a Jewish national home, but was also the one that, as in India, introduced the concept and the idea of partition in the late 1940s, which is also, I think, an important part of the explanation of all the horrors that we continue to see to this very day. So it is in that context of the collective dispossession of the Palestinian people in 1948, of their transformation into a people of stateless refugees. That is the basis for understanding everything that has happened since, including what we have experienced and witnessed during the past year. So that's just by way of background. And I'll be, the other, of course, main development is that in 1967, Israel launched a war initially against Egypt, in the course of which it seized the remaining 22% of mandatory Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So it had already ruled the Gaza Strip for over half a century and pursued a policy of what the leading specialist on the Gaza Strip, Sarah Roy of Harvard University, calls a policy of de-development, which goes beyond underdevelopment. She defines de-development as a policy of making any future development impossible. And then there were 17 years of blockade starting in 2006. Repeated Israeli military onslaughts on the Gaza Strip, and it was in the context of this untenable status quo that October 7th happened. Now, on October 7th, of course, is the day on which the crisis erupted. But as I've tried to indicate, it was a crisis that was many years, if not decades, in the making, and was more or less a foregone conclusion that a crisis would erupt in one form or another, precisely because of the realities that had obtained for so many years.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a crisp yet detailed response. As a brief follow up, I remember reading once in an interview by Noam Chomsky that Zionism inherently wasn't meant to be exclusive or culminate in dispossession, that there was a benign version to it which merely asserted claims to a national homeland without implying or necessitating expulsion. Do you think, based on the intellectual history or the trajectory of Zionism that was traced from the late 19th century to what's happening currently, do you think it's fair to say that there is scope for such a version of Zionism being resuscitated, or are you not hopeful regarding it?
Well, there were, of course, differing strands of Zionism. There was what was known as cultural Zionism, which proposed a binational form of coexistence between um, uh, immigrant Jews and the existing Palestinian Arab population, and so I'm not denying that there were different forms of Zionism. The point I would make is that Zionism has always been led by the Zionist movement has from the outset been led by people who were dedicated to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine from the very outset. And they always controlled the decision making and the power within that movement. That, of course, that isn't meant to deny that within that framework, that other much more benign forms of Zionism, which would have led to very different outcomes, also existed. So, in that sense, Chomsky is right. But I would argue that within the framework of a nationalist movement, the nationalists were always going to emerge victorious. This is not something peculiar to Zionism by any means. I think it's fair to say it would have been the case with any other nationalist movement. So, it's and people, these other forms of Zionism, they still do have adherents. Scholarship is still being written about them, and these can be, very progressive people who, up to and including the continued existence of the Israeli state in preference of a more binational arrangement. And so I would argue that these are unfortunately rather marginal phenomena, and that certainly in the current situation, I mean, if elections were held in Israel tomorrow, they wouldn't win a single parliamentary seat.
Okay. Hello. Am I audible?
Hi.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to begin by saying we generally appreciate all of the work that you've done with regards to
Thank
the
you.
Palestinian struggle.
Thank
So
you.
the next question is regarding the larger reaction that the NATO line West has had to
Sorry, the
Israel's
larger reaction that.
the NATO line West has
Mhm.
had to. So we see that post the Russia-Ukraine war, Russian athletes and were prohibited from partaking in sports meets, yet the same reaction has not been extended to Israel after having conducted a campaign that is at least on par, if not worse, than that of the Russians. So, do you think that there is a contradiction within how NATO and other countries that come under the ambit of NATO see themselves? And
Yes. Yeah, it's a very good question. I was just reading about I believe it was an early 20th century Peruvian president who seized power in a military coup and made the well-known statement, "To my friends, everything; to my enemies, the law." And I think we see that very clearly in this case. Long before um, uh, Russia invaded Ukraine, there had been a campaign for years with the relevant governing bodies of international football, FIFA and UEFA, to, as it was put by the campaign, show the red card to Israeli racism. And the constant refrain from the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino, and from UEFA was sports and politics cannot and should not mix. We should keep them separate, and so on. And this was kind of the pretext used to avoid taking any measures whatsoever against the Israeli Football Association and Israeli football clubs. Then on the 22nd of February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, and literally by the end of that week, the Russian Football Association and every single Russian football club is expelled from international football competition. It's a bit more. It's quite difficult to think of a more glaring example of double standards. Then we take, for example, the International Criminal Court, which has been very much in the news in recent weeks, when within a year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. You look at the reaction from Western leaders, and their praise for the independence and the neutrality and professionalism of the International Court and of its prosecutor, Karim Khan. It was over the top. This is how justice is supposed to operate. This is how justice is done. This is done because the ICC is so professional and operates above politics, and so on. Now in 2024, the same court, acting on acting on the recommendation of the same prosecutor, issues an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and all of a sudden the prosecutor is the devil incarnate. The ICC needs to be sanctioned and destroyed because it's not fit for purpose, because it's the successor organization to the Nazi Party, because it's engaged in a blood libel, etc., etc., etc. So the double standards couldn't be more glaring, to the extent that, with respect to the recent ceasefire that was reached with regard to Lebanon, according to reporting by a prominent Israeli journalist, a key Israeli demand in order to sign on to this agreement had been that France make a public statement that it would not seek the arrest of Netanyahu in accordance with the ICC warrant if he set foot on French soil. And if there is going to be a further agreement with respect to Gaza, I suspect there also a key component of it will be that Israel's war criminals should continue to enjoy absolute and unrestricted impunity for their war crimes, for their crimes against humanity, for their participation in genocide. So, as this Peruvian leader said, the principle here is very simple: for my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law.
Thank you for that answer, sir. Moving on to the next question, we have a more domestic question, so to say, which is that a lot of people among the West have had this notion that they can't get behind Hamas because it's primarily a fundamentalist organization. So, do you think that within the coming years or possibly decades, there can be a resurgence of some of the other organizations, such as the PLO, that have not aligned with Islam as hardly, or some new organization coming up that takes the leadership of the Palestinian struggle?
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think the first part of the answer should be to examine how Hamas became such a prominent Palestinian organization and movement, because, of course, until the late 1980s, Hamas didn't exist. And the Islamist movement that spawned it, the Muslim Brotherhood, was not really actively involved in the national struggle. That struggle was dominated by the nationalist Fatah movement and the left wing Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, within the occupied territories by the Palestine Communist Party, and others. Um, why was Hamas able to overtake them? Well, if we look, I think the best assessment of this are the 2006 Palestinian Legislative Council elections, which were overwhelmingly won by Hamas against its main rival, Fatah, even though, while Hamas won a veto proof majority of parliamentary seats, if I'm not mistaken, it did not win an outright majority of the popular vote, but nevertheless, it won. Now, the explanation for why it won is often ascribed to the corruption of the Palestinian Authority leadership, its mismanagement of affairs, and so on. And clearly, all of that did play a role. But I've always argued that the key reason that the mainstream nationalist movement lost is because it failed to achieve the fundamental principles, strategic objectives of its political program. Fatah put forward a program of seeking to resolve the question of Palestine through a negotiated two-state settlement. Well, when you're in a context where Israel refuses to even negotiate with the Palestinians, let alone relinquish its occupation and enable the establishment of a independent, sovereign Palestinian state. And let's remember, on just 22% of the territory of mandatory Palestine, it's kind of logical that under such circumstances, a movement that advocates for a more activist form of resistance to occupation rather than accommodation for it is going to overtake the mainstream nationalist movements. Why was it Hamas, the Islamist movement, rather than leftist movements like the PFLP or DFLP? Well, part of it has to do with geopolitical changes, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the emergence of more identity-based politics and so on. Um, but that's what happened. Now when we look to the future, I would argue that we're now in a situation where the key to any answer to your question is not whether Fatah or other organizations managed to rejuvenate themselves to once again seize leadership of the national movement at the expense of Hamas. Nor do I think the solution is one where Hamas manages to establish its own hegemony of the national movement. But we're now quite clearly in a situation where only consensus and power sharing among the main Palestinian movements is going to provide an effective path forward. Under current circumstances, that means giving a prominent role to not only Hamas, but also the inclusion of Islamic Jihad. If the nationalists and the leftist movements manage to reinvent themselves as meaningful movements that are confronting the occupation, that are resisting it, that are providing a meaningful, achievable program to the Palestinian people. Under such circumstances, I have no doubt that they will once again be able to appeal to a very broad-based section of the Palestinian people. Because let's remember, the Palestinians are not a Muslim people. Yes, the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, but Palestinians are spread out over religion, over geography, over class boundaries, and so on. And so, what is really required is an inclusive movement that not only represents the entirety of the Palestinian people, but is seen to represent and believed to represent the entirety of the Palestinian people. And Hamas's rivals have unfortunately in recent years failed miserably on that core responsibility.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful response. Since, as Rijul mentioned, that the previous question pertained to a domestic aspect of the Palestinian side, as a follow-up, I have a question regarding Israel and its domestic affairs. So, my question essentially is the refusal or the inability to come to a deal or to negotiate fairly a political problem, or is it a structural problem? For instance, it seems to many people that the inability of Israel to come to a deal is due to the fact that, say, if Netanyahu agrees to negotiate, his partners in the Israeli parliament are going to withdraw support from his government. But on the other hand, there are people who are inclined to say that the very dynamics between the state of Israel and what's happening currently in Palestine is to be blamed rather than one political faction. So is it a political problem or is it a structural problem?
Yeah, very, very good question. I would say it's both and then some. I think we're past the point where domestic Israeli public opinion um, can exercise meaningful pressure on the Israeli leadership to reach a meaningful resolution of the question of Palestine with the Palestinians. I think we're way past that point. I think in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, it could have happened. But I think what has happened since the beginning of the new millennium, if not earlier, but let's say since the year 2000, is that Israeli politics and society has shifted so decisively to the right that it is no longer capable of envisioning the kinds of policies that would be required to achieve peaceful coexistence with not only the Palestinians, but with the region as a whole. I mean, you look at the current Israeli government, it's outright annexationist. It proclaims apartheid as part of its political program, with its statement that the Jewish people have an exclusive right to self-determination between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, which is, by the way, it's not only part of the current government's political program. It's almost a constitutional law of Israel because it was adopted by the parliament some years ago. So even if Netanyahu ditched his far right coalition partners, there are no alternatives within the Israeli political spectrum at present that would allow him to, on the one hand, form a parliamentary majority and at the same time adopt kind of policies that would lead to meaningful coexistence with the Palestinians. That's even without getting into the issue that Netanyahu overwhelmingly shares the vision of his far right partners. But I don't, but to properly answer this question, I think it would be wrong to look only at Israel, because we have to look at the symbiotic relationship between Israel, growing Israeli radicalization and extremism on the one hand, and Israeli impunity as enabled by the United States and Europe on the other. In other words, as Israel has shifted to the right, its impunity and lack of accountability has in fact increased rather than decreased. And so we've gotten into this vicious cycle where the longer the leash that the West gives its Israeli proxy, the more radical Israel becomes. And so, as I stated at the outset of my response to your question, I don't think we can look only at Israel. We have to we have to look at kind of this vicious cycle of radicalism and fanaticism and extremism, which is being constantly enabled and fed and facilitated by increasingly unconditional Western support for Israel, now up to and including a live streamed genocide. So it's almost counterintuitive to believe that Israel's domestic politics can lead to a change of course. I mean, it's almost like, you let a child loose in a candy store, and the more wild this kid becomes, the more you allow, the more you encourage him to grab yet more sweets. That's kind of the situation we are in.
So, continuing along the same lines of the you know relationship that US has had to Israel, uh, given that Trump was recently re-elected to office, he's also had a soft spot for Assad in Syria, and that puts Israel in a particularly contentious spot. So, do you think moving forward we're going to see the relationship between Israel and US change because of this?
The problem with your question is that Trump is such erratic, unpredictable, unreliable politician that anything is possible, and the opposite of anything is just as possible as well. So it's very difficult, I think, to confidently give a clear answer to your question. On the one hand, Trump has well-known, very pro-Israeli instincts. You look at the kind of nominations that he's been making for his cabinet, and these tend to be people who are almost as fanatically devoted to Israel as Joe Biden, if not more so. Um, uh, at the same time, Trump is known to be a very transactional politician. So, if you compare him to the present administration, you could make the case that he's willing to provide Israel with all the weapons that the Biden administration has, perhaps even with more so, but with the important difference that he would want the Israelis to pay for them and no longer get them for free. I'm just giving an example. And at the same time, you have to also look at the constituencies that elected Trump. On the one hand, you have the Christian evangelical constituency, which is known for being extremely pro-Israeli. And then you also have the anti-war and isolationist constituency. And Trump is also known as someone who likes to promote himself as being anti-war. He falsely claims he opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but he's also presented himself as someone who will end wars and will not want to get the U.S. directly involved in another land war in the Middle East, because I think he also understands that a direct U.S. Iranian military confrontation will make Iraq look like child's play. So, you take all these things together. I think it was recently Aaron Lund, the Swedish analyst, writing, I believe, for the Millennium Foundation, who said, there's going to be, you put all this together, and perhaps the best prediction that can be made about Trump's Middle East policy is that it will be chaos. And in some cases, those he appointed will be able to run policy as if there's no White House. In other cases, the White House will seek to impose clear guidelines based either on its own preferences or those of its constituencies or those of its donors. So it's very, very difficult to say. I will point out, though, one key difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. If you look at the first Trump administration, and here I'm looking specifically at the issue of Iran, there was a very clear alignment between Washington, Israel, and Washington's Arab client regimes. All of them wanted to see increased tensions and hostility between the United States and Iran. All of them supported Trump's unilateral renunciation of the Iranian nuclear agreement. All of them supported the policy of maximum, maximum pressure. And all of them were, in fact, agitating for a US Iranian confrontation. The situation now is quite different. If you look, for example, at the Gulf Cooperation Council states, they saw that the result of their policy during the first Trump administration was that, on the one hand, you had Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, shooting missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia and, to a lesser extent, the United Arab Emirates. And the US did nothing to protect them, certainly not if you compare it to its current deployment of a naval task force to the Red Sea. Then, when Iran attacked the vital Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia in 2019, Trump didn't lift a finger to help them. So they now understand that in the event of such a confrontation, the main victims are not going to be Israel or the United States, but those who sit immediately across the Persian Gulf from Iran's very capable missile force. The other issue is that these Gulf Cooperation Council states, on the whole, during the first Trump administration, viewed Israel as a reliable security partner, as a partner who could help defend them against their regional rivals, chiefly Iran. Now they look at Israel and they see a government, a state, that appears determined to set the entire region aflame, and if necessary, doing so at their expense. So you don't have the same alignment, the same coalition agitating for increased confrontation with Iran. And, Trump, I think, is very keen also to resume brokering a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. Well, Saudi Arabia won't be able to do in 2024 what the United Arab Emirates did in 2020. I mean, Saudi Arabia wasn't prepared to do it in 2020, and it can't do it in 2024. If the Saudis go to the Americans and say, we want to do this deal, but only if there's an end to the Israeli occupation, how will Trump react? Will he shelve the deal? Will he pressure the Israelis to end the occupation? These are, I think, all open questions that are very difficult to answer prior to the assumption of office of the Trump administration. Again, because as I pointed out, Trump is so erratic and unpredictable and unreliable that it's very speculative.
Thank you so much, sir, for this such an elaborate and extensive answer. We are nearing the end of this conversation since I understand that you have an interview
Mm.
scheduled right afterwards as well. And these questions are more towards the ethical side of this conflict and the sheer proportions of the human tragedy that accompanies it. So this is the first part of it. Uh, how do you, how does one deal with the sheer quantum of displacement and the deprivation of individuals and their families and descendants of their homelands in the 21st century? So much time has passed. It's a huge population. It has a rightful claim to their homes from which they were displaced. How do you think we ought to go about this, or how does the world go about approaching this at this moment of time?
Oh, sorry, just to make sure I understood your question properly. Are you asking how should we deal with the question of 1948 Palestinian refugees? Is that what you were asking?
Huh. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the simple answer is that their rights are enshrined in international law and in UN resolutions, and there is no compelling reason, as with international football or the ICC, to say Yes, we believe in international law. Yes, we believe in the applicability of UN resolutions. But not when it comes to Palestine. That's an exception. When it comes to Palestine, international law is irrelevant. Um, uh, UN resolutions should be honored solely in the breach, and so what we demand for ourselves and for our friends, we make a point of denying to others. That's clearly not going to work, and it is these double standards and this Palestine exception, as it's called, and this dedication and determination to perpetuate Israeli impunity and lack of accountability. That is a very significant part of the explanation of how we've arrived where we are today. But to answer your question, first part of it is the answer is very clear. There are UN resolutions, there is international law, there are universal norms and values and standards and treaties that govern these issues. And they say very clearly that those who were displaced in 1948 have a right to return and a right to compensation for lost properties. And you know, the idea that these rights are simply going to evaporate is, I think, a pipe dream. And so that's the first part of my response. The second part of my response is that when we get to the political realm, things, of course, get a bit more complicated, particularly if we're going to be talking about a two-state settlement, which I don't think is on the horizon. A two-state settlement has really become a slogan to camouflage reality rather than any serious policy by those who proclaim their adherence to it. But let's say that it was serious and on the table today. Then, of course, mechanism will have to be found to ensure that, on the one hand, Palestinians achieve their rights, and on the other hand, that the implementation of those rights is done in a manner that is consistent with a two-state settlement framework. And here I will just give a general answer and say that the key to unlocking this conundrum is the recognition of those rights and the recognition of the injustice that has been visited upon this people for the better part of a century. Absent that recognition, nothing is possible. On the basis of that of a clear and unambiguous recognition, many options, I think, will become available. But the idea that this a solution can be purchased with Arab, Arab states donating their petro revenues to some international fund that will be managed by the Americans and the Europeans. No, that's not how things work. People need to have their rights acknowledged. People need to have their rights recognized. People need to have the injustice that was inflicted upon them clearly and unambiguously acknowledged, rather than a bunch of tricks and smoke and mirrors, and then we'll talk. And if you're worried about the potential implications of recognizing those rights or recognizing the wrongs that were done, that proves not that the Palestinians, but that those refusing to make these recognitions are the problem.
Thank you so much, sir. And I would just like to latch onto one of the points that you mentioned there as the final question of our
Sure.
conversation. So you pointed out that double standards are invariably applied when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, quote-unquote conflict, as they put it. Uh, Another aspect in which I find these double standards operating in a very conspicuous manner is in the censorship that goes on, especially in the West, when it comes to policing the norms of what is acceptable, wherein they'll only allow forms of criticism which they approve of. And when you'll have Arabs or especially Muslims in countries like, especially Germany recently, or even in the United States, you find even parties that are otherwise quote unquote progressive absolutely repudiating the rights to free speech. So how does one understand or take cognizance of the forms of censorship that go on, especially with respect to the student resistance there or the protests that have been going on in the West over on?
Yeah, well, I think this is significant on several levels. The first one is precisely as you mentioned, the growing and really unprecedented suppression of rights that are already enshrined in law, but are being abrogated when it comes to expressions of solidarity with the Palestinian people, or opposition to Israel, or even opposition to genocide. I mean, what we've seen in the past year is I believe, has very little, if any, precedent in recent history. So there's that. There's the deliberate um, attack on freedom of speech and so on that is specifically targeted at Palestinian, or let's call it pro-Palestinian speech. But there's a bigger picture here, that the pro-Palestinian speech is also the canary in the coal mine. Um, One reason that many of these initiatives to silence pro-Palestinian speech are being supported by right-wing forces, yes, they are pro-Israeli, but they also recognize that the pro-Palestinian speech is the weak link in the chain, and that if you can use pro-Palestine the efforts to suppress pro-Palestinian speech as a battering ram to change the legal framework and so on. Then once you've crossed that threshold, you can then use the same forms of repression against all kinds of other issues. So, for example, to suppress free speech on the climate emergency, on women's reproductive rights, on a host of other issues. And it's the same, I think, with regard to the earlier issues that we were discussing about international law and the International Criminal Court. Yes, many of these Western states are genuinely outraged. They are genuinely, sincerely hysterical. They are genuinely besides themselves at the mere suggestion that Israel should be held accountable for its war crimes and crimes humanity. To them, this is something, that should have never happened. But at the same time, we have to also recognize that in many cases, these are states that want to get rid of the entire edifice of international law, that have a deeply ingrained hostility to international institutions and international legal institutions. And so, if they can use the opposition to Palestine as a battering ram to dismantle international law, to dismantle international institutions and international legal institutions, well, it's much easier than doing that on the basis of opposition, for example, to other cases like let's say Ukraine or Myanmar or whatever. So I would say that for many of these uh, right wing forces, Israel is not only an important cause in and of itself for them, but Israel is also a battering ram they can use to achieve much broader political and legislative and ideological objectives.
Thank you so much, sir. And I must indeed say that the last point on which you ended in the response was a very profound point about the broader political aims or goals that underlie such censorship. Thank you so much, sir, for giving
Thank
us.
you.
Indeed, a pleasure to listen to your insights for all our questions. Thank you so much, sir.
It's a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you. Goodbye.